So welcome everyone. My name is Alan Fleming. I'm on the one of the people on the organizing committee for this series, and many of you will have been at the first three series, the first season as we're calling it. Fantastically successful. We had about 70, 75 people in the room, and another 25 or so online every time. So that's quite a number of people showing up for these conversations. And based on that enthusiasm, we put together a second series. What we've tried to do is make it more of a, like, how can we move forward? Our goal remains the same, to create meaningful opportunities to have conversations and to build community. So tonight, Jon Allen will be speaking about his perspective as a former ambassador, the Canadian ambassador to Israel.
Thank you to the Danforth Jewish Circle for the invitation to be here, to Michael and Harriet and to Alan, with whom I had a conversation initially about this. I look forward to your questions after I speak, because that's usually the most interesting part of these events. I want to start with my take on the response to October 7th and the war that followed here in Canada. And then I'll go on to talk about what's happening in the region vis-a-vis the Israelis and the Palestinians and the broader region. But before I do that, I want to be totally transparent. I'm Jewish, as most of you know. My wife, Clara, who's here, is the child of Holocaust survivors. I have a sister and a niece and nephews who live on a kibbutz in Israel called Kfar Blum, not far from the Lebanese border, and Hezbollah rockets. Second, I have been opposed to the Israeli settlement project, to the occupation, and to Israel's treatment of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank since long before I was appointed as ambassador to Israel by Stephen Harper. I continue to believe in and advocate for a two-state solution as the only means of ending the conflict. And let me also say that I'm very cognizant of the fact that I don't live in the region, I don't live under occupation, I'm not subject to daily bombings and rocket fire, I don't send my children to the army for 3 years to defend my country, or fear for terrorists crossing the border and invading my community. Also, let me say that while I have been emotionally torn since shortly after October 7, as I imagine many of you have been, I am frankly unable to understand why so many Jews and Muslims alike find it so hard to hold in their hearts feelings of sympathy and pain for the many thousands of dead and injured innocent Palestinians on the one hand, and for the families of the dead and injured Israelis and the hostages still being held in Gaza on the other. Understanding and dissecting this war and its antecedents is undoubtedly complicated, but recognizing the death and the destruction that it has produced on both sides should not be. I'm also distressed by the hate, the extremism, the anti-Semitism, and the anti-Palestinian racism that has been generated by so many people, especially university-educated young people, many of whom don't seem to understand that this is a complex and long-standing conflict, and that there is plenty of past blame and responsibility on both sides. There is today in Canada polarization among communities and within communities. Rabbis, imams, and ministers have been unable to mourn together, unlike in the past when they were able to do so. Within the Jewish community, some, like me, who are critical of Israeli activities in the war in Gaza, are sometimes accused of being anti-Israel or self-hating Jews. Public criticism of the Israeli government, no matter how dangerous the efforts to destroy illiberal democracy there, are seen not as support for the 70% of Israelis who want Bibi Netanyahu to resign, but rather as contributing to anti-Semitism, which CIJA and other establishment Jews claim is rampant in Canada today. The situation is similar for Palestinians, who believe that what happened on October 7 may have happened within a broader context, but who nonetheless condemn the massacre as a horrific war crime. Campus protesters scream genocide, demand a Palestine from the river to the sea, and suggest that Jews in Israel are colonials who have no ties to the land and should return to Europe from whence they came. Israel's staunchest supporters say that what's taking place in Gaza is a just war of self-defense and see all or most Palestinians as terrorists or would-be terrorists who support the destruction of the state of Israel. They view two states as a recipe for more October 7s, and that all criticism of Israel, as I said, is a cover for anti-Semitism. My take, for what it's worth, is that too many people are operating completely in their own lane, rooting only for their own team. Many Jews and Arabs alike are simply unable to hold multiple truths in their heads at the same time. Despite what some might honestly believe, especially as we observe the horrors of the current war, the broken ceasefire, and recall the attacks of October 7, this conflict has no simple good guys and bad guys. Israelis and Palestinians each view themselves as victims. Each have existential fears. Each have valid narratives that cannot be easily reconciled. And each are currently experiencing severe trauma. Finally, both, as I said, bear some of the blame for where they are today and how they got there. October 7 was a massive failure of military and intelligence by the IDF, by the Shin Bet, and by the Mossad, and a horrific act of violence by extreme ideological Hamas, who would, if they could, drive Jewish Israelis from their home. The inquiries into October 7 by the Shin Bet and by the IDF, the Prime Minister refuses to appoint a state commission of inquiry, as is the norm in Israel, have pointed to various factors. The failure to accept intelligence on the ground that showed Hamas planning the attack, an over-reliance on technology on the southern border with Gaza, the transfer of 4 battalions from Gaza to counter violence in the West Bank, leaving only 400 soldiers to defend against 3,000 to 5,000 Hamas terrorists. It's important to note here that the violence in the West Bank was provoked in part by the settlement expansion there and the settler-led violence that is supported by Israeli far-right ministers Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. What also had come to light previously and was confirmed by the Shin Bet was that the Netanyahu government had given the green light for Qatar to send hundreds of millions of dollars to Hamas. Bibi Netanyahu was recorded as telling his Likud caucus that this would ensure that Hamas and the PA, the Palestinian Authority, would never unite, and that he could continue to argue that there was no partner for peace. Turning to the agonizing situation of the hostages, As far as we know, only 25 of the 59 remaining hostages in captivity are alive, of a total of 250 that were taken on October 7. Even though the vast majority of hostages have been freed via negotiations, and that at least 8 and probably several more died during IDF military operations, the current coalition, for purely political reasons, has broken the ceasefire it had agreed to and resumed airstrikes, killing some 700 Palestinians in the last 10 days. Ironically, most of those killed on the kibbutzim that border Gaza were peaceniks. They drove Palestinians from the checkpoints to Israeli hospitals. They hired Gazans to work in their fields. Vivian Silver, a Winnipegger like Clara and me, founded and led an Israeli-Palestinian organization called Women Waging Peace. Her son, Yonatan, continues to advocate for an end to the war and Israeli-Palestinian coexistence. While hard for the rest of the world to understand, especially considering the massive death and destruction in Gaza that followed, Israelis today remain in trauma. The failure of their intelligence and defense institutions, the hostages, the burnt-out towns and kibbutzim, the dead soldiers, over 400, and the fact that approximately 70% of them want their prime minister to resign, have left them deeply distressed and angry. Also, we should remember that at one point, Israel was facing rocket fire from Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran, and that 60,000 Israelis in the north were displaced from their homes. Much has changed on the regional front since then, and I'll briefly come back to that. But the bottom line is that Israelis are very much still stuck on October the 7th and on its aftermath. And the vast majority have no empathy for the massive death and destruction their military has wrought in Gaza. So let's talk about Gaza for a minute, and the mostly innocent approximately 2.2 million Palestinians living there. Israel responded to October 7 with a mix of fear, shame, and a desire for revenge. While deterrence and the search for justice were key, the revenge factor seemed to characterize much of the action of the IDF, its leadership, and frankly, the views of a majority of Israelis. The results are unimaginable. In 17 months, some 55,000 dead and over 100,000 injured. Numbers which, according to at least one study in The Lancet, are underestimations. 60 to 70% of Gaza has been destroyed, including hospitals, universities, schools, and of course, people's homes. Polling done up to October 7 in Gaza by Princeton University showed at that time that only 26% of Gazans supported Hamas. And I should remind you that Hamas is the ruling government in Gaza and that many people worked for Hamas and may have been reluctant to say otherwise. Hamas, of course, has ruled the Strip since 2005, when it won an election, and it has done so essentially with an iron fist. Without going into a lot of detail now, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, my take is that while Israel clearly had and has a right to self-defense and to respond with force to the attack on October 7, there is no excuse whatsoever for the barbarism of the attack by Hamas. Both the attack and the response breached international humanitarian law on a number of grounds. Kidnapping and killing innocent civilians is a massive breach of humanitarian law, and the actions of Hamas subsequently, protecting themselves in tunnels while letting average Gazans die above, commandeering the little food and humanitarian supplies that was entering Gaza, and using hospitals and universities as shields to hide their militants, were all violations of international humanitarian law. For Israel's part, the initial 2-week siege, the restrictions on humanitarian assistance for 15 months are the most obvious war crimes. If the Prime Minister continues to withhold all food, assistance, and electricity until all the hostages are released, he, his military, and Israel risk further widespread condemnation from the international community for further war crimes. That's collective punishment of innocent civilians. The incessant and widespread bombings that have occurred in Gaza without sufficient regard for the loss of innocent lives by the IDF also likely fall into the category of war crimes. I have written on the International Criminal Court warrants against Bibi Netanyahu and his former Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant. I will say only one thing in this regard, that if Israel's Attorney General were to take the accusations of the International Criminal Court seriously and genuinely investigate the charges in Israel, the International Criminal Court would have no jurisdiction to proceed. I will leave it to the International Court of Justice to decide on the allegations of genocide. That crime requires an intent to wipe out all or part of a group. While such intent is difficult to establish, an Israeli human rights lawyer based in Paris has written recently about a possible case of incitement to cause genocide that could well be brought against the government. Based on various statements by Bibi Netanyahu, his various ministers, the Chief of Defense Staff, and even regrettably, Bougie Herzog, the president, who was once the leader of the Labour Party, my assessment is there's a fairly strong case to be made of incitement to genocide. Indeed, seemingly deaf to the possibility of such charges, the Deputy Speaker of the Knesset last week called for all Gazans to be killed. Let me turn briefly to the current dynamics in the region. Ironically, the Trump election initially brought some optimism. Steve Witkoff, his Middle East envoy, forced Bibi to agree to the Biden-Netanyahu plan of May 2024. Hostages were exchanged for prisoners, a ceasefire took hold, and the second and third phases of the ceasefire, if negotiated, optimistically envisaged more hostage releases, an end to the war, and the beginning of reconstruction and significant flows of humanitarian assistance. Indeed, that ceasefire could and should have happened last May. Between then and when the deal was finally agreed, thousands of Palestinians, 122 IDF soldiers, and at least 8 hostages died because of political games being played in Israel. How many more will die if Israeli rocket attacks continues now is not known. At the same time, there was some hope that in Trump's efforts to win a Nobel Peace Prize, which he is allegedly obsessed about because Barack Obama got one, he might have wanted, and there was real hope in this, that he might have wanted to follow the Biden plan to negotiate a more comprehensive Saudi, Israeli, US deal that would include a Palestinian state. Instead, quite out of the blue, typically Donald Trump, he floated his illegal and immoral scheme to force 2.2 million Palestinians out of Gaza so that he and others could develop a resort and more. If it weren't so sad and so dangerous, the Israeli government is currently drawing up plans to encourage mass Palestinian migration. It would be the stuff of comedy. Today, there is a stalemate. Bibi refuses to move the IDF out of Gaza and off the Philadelphia corridor, or to discuss plans for the day after. He and Trump continue to promise to wipe out Hamas, while Tony Blinken said on his last days as Secretary of State that the war likely created some 15,000 new Hamas militants. And frankly, no one really believes that Hamas can be eliminated, including the former Minister of Defense and his Chief of Staff. Bibi's right-wing ministers and Bibi himself do not want the war to end. His trial would be accelerated, pressure for a state commission of inquiry would increase, and he might well face elections. Meanwhile, Israel has begun a major new offensive in the West Bank to root out Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad militants there, and in the process, 40,000 Palestinians have been forced from their homes, and violence against Palestinians by settlers continues without any pushback by the IDF or the Israeli government. Regionally, in addition to turning Hamas from an army with 4 battalions, rockets, and tunnels into an insurgency, Israel has also achieved major victories in Lebanon against Hezbollah, This not only seriously weakened Hezbollah, but also stripped Iran of its strongest and most important proxy. Israel then successfully knocked out Iran's air force and air defense infrastructure. Taken together with the fall of the Assad family dynasty in Syria, which cuts Hezbollah off from Iran's army shipments, Israel has been able to declare some important and real strategic wins. This has given Israelis a boost in confidence in their institutions, something much needed. But the question remains, will Israel use these wins wisely as buffer zones and seek relationships with the new Lebanese and Syrian governments, or choose to try to become a regional hegemon and stay in Lebanon, in Gaza, and Syria, and possibly become enmeshed in military quagmires? It's happened before. Finally, it's unclear what the intentions of Israel and the Trump administration are vis-à-vis Iran. Now, this is where I normally tell my audiences that despite everything, the war, the efforts by Bibi to dismantle Israel's democracy, Hamas's complete intransigence and violence, the demographic challenges in Israel, and the shift to the right among Jewish Israelis. This is where I say I remain optimistic that saner heads will eventually prevail, that new leadership on both sides will appear, and that governments on both sides will realize that none of the 7.5 million Arabs and the 7.5 million Jews who live between the river and the sea are going anywhere. Although Trump's victory, Bibi's ability to stay in power, and his continuing attacks on Israel's democracy, and the resumption of the war all give reason for despair. I do find hope. Where? First, as mentioned, the recognition of Palestinian rights and the requirement for a two-state solution was made all the more obvious by October 7. Until Trump's election, all Western countries and the Arab world seemed finally to agree and to be ready to act that only a move towards two states could prevent further October 7th. And also, a movement to recognize Palestine as a state was gaining ground. It was clear that given the mutual trauma, such efforts would have to wait some time, and Bibi Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas leadership would have to pass from the scene. Indeed, there are already polls that suggest if asked the right questions and offered the right incentives, both Israelis and Palestinians would prefer two states over the status quo. For example, while 60% of Israelis support the Trump plan to deport Gazans, a similar number also support an agreement that would integrate Israel into the region, the Saudi, Israel, US, Palestine deal, if it included even if it included a Palestinian state. Second, past failures at peace, and there have been many, and missed opportunities shouldn't mean that you never try again. The two sides were close before. Don't stop trying now. The 6 final status issues that were discussed between Clinton, Arafat, and Rabin 30 years ago remain on the table today, with different leaders who are prepared to compromise and who have the strength to exclude the extremists on both sides, Hamas and the Messianics. Two states still have a chance. Neither Israelis nor Palestinians want to continue to live in insecurity and fear. Neither want their sons and daughters to continue to die in conflict. And if you don't believe me, ask former Israeli prime ministers Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak, who agree and who are now today advocating that two states is the only way forward. Ask former Foreign Minister of Palestine, Nasser El-Kidwa, who is traveling the world with Olmert, advocating for two states. Ask the hundreds of former heads of Mossad, of the IDF, and of the Shin Bet, who are part of an organization called Commanders for Israel's Security. Look it up. They all agree that two states for two peoples is the only way out of the current morass. Finally, let me remind you that few people believed that the conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland would end after 400 years of fighting. Few people believed that apartheid would disappear when it did. And no one suspected that the Berlin Wall would fall in 1989 when it fell. Anwar Sadat was in the Knesset talking peace 4 years after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And he signed a peace treaty with Israel 2 years later. Between 70 and 85 million people died in World War II. Yet just 7 years after the war, the European Coal and Steel Community, the precursor to the EU, was formed. Hated enemies came together in a common cause. Surprises happen in international relations, and sometimes surprising events, like an October 7, can force people to change their perspectives, to get out of their lanes, and to move to the center where compromise and peace and security exist. Amos Oz, when he was alive, explained how he saw these issues playing out. He saw the conflict as a kind of dramatic play, and he said that it could have one of two endings. It could be a Shakespearean tragedy where everybody at the end was dead on the stage. Or it could be a Chekhovian play where everybody at the end was depressed and in despair and overwrought, but alive. Let's hope that Amos is right and that Chekhov is right. The other place that I find hope is the not-for-profit that I chair called Rosanna Canada. We're part of an international network that raises funds for projects in the health sector in Palestine and in Israel. The goal is to use health to bring together Israelis and Palestinians in an atmosphere of respect and dignity and trust. We train Palestinian and Israeli health professionals together. 250 Palestinian nurses, 250 Israeli nurses. We teach the Israelis Arabic, we teach the Palestinians Hebrew. We have courses in resilience and conflict resolution. A Palestinian team of health professionals treat Palestinian women and children in remote West Bank villages using Israeli technology from Sheba Hospital. We transport Palestinian patients, mostly women and children, from their West Bank checkpoints to and from their appointments at Israeli hospitals. One of our drivers was Vivian Silver. Our latest project was a primary health care clinic in Gaza that we were funding together with an American NGO. We were providing essential care for 6,000 Gazans per month in a tent clinic in Gaza City and Khan Yunis. Despite the horrific events of the last year, our health professionals have been able to work and train together, and all of our projects have continued. Rosanna is just one of the many people-to-people organizations that bring Israelis and Palestinians together despite these very difficult times. Seeing our projects in action, knowing that we can continue to succeed in our goal of building trust, gives me hope. I hope it does for you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jon.
Right now, with Donald Trump as the president, which makes everything completely unknown and completely unpredictable, and a significant degree of license that has been given to world leaders that they can emulate Orban. Orban was the first to use democracy, to get elected, and then to begin to destroy that democracy by taking over the courts, then the press, and reducing freedoms, giving jobs to all of his friends, and securing a kind of populist majority. Bolsonaro followed. Trump, of course, in his first term. So these are all, they all play by the rule book to get elected, and then they do what they can to, and Bibi's doing it right now. Bibi has, as you all know, fired his director of this internal security service, the Shin Bet. He's also fired the attorney general, who is now prosecuting his case. Neither of those have taken effect because there are challenges going to the Supreme Court. Whether they take effect is not clear. But as we all fear in the United States and possibly in Israel, it can go to the Supreme Court can rule, but what if the leader decides to ignore that? The Supreme Court doesn't have an army, it doesn't have a police force, and if you control the army and the police force, then you're in big trouble. And so yeah, now I say that, but on the other hand, Duterte from the Philippines was just transferred to the ICC. Others have ended up at the ICC. And Bibi Netanyahu, if he is defeated at the end of next year when there's an election, and if he chooses to travel to other than Hungary, to some other country which is a party, and has the guts to arrest him, then he well could be arrested. So international law is not, it doesn't also have an army or a police force, but it's there and it's a deterrent. So I remain, as always, optimistic. Okay, well, the PLO accepted the existence of Israel many, many years ago. Mahmoud Abbas, who heads the Palestinian Authority, not only has accepted the existence of the State of Israel, but cooperates every day with the State of Israel to prevent terrorism from the West Bank. Meanwhile, Bibi disses him on a daily basis and, as I said, allows money to flow to Hamas. As far as Hamas is concerned, I would agree completely. I don't think one can rely on Hamas and the plans that Biden had developed and the Egyptian peace plan that has come out does not envisage Hamas in the picture in a future Palestinian state. Pay for Slay was a program that the Palestinian Authority had when a Palestinian was convicted and sent to jail, detained. The Palestinian Authority would provide funds to his family. You know, it's either, depending on your perspective, social security or support for terrorism. Okay, in some cases you could argue it's support for terrorism because a terrorist committed a crime, was put in jail, and the state provided money for him, but for his family, not for him. But again, that is separate and apart from whether or not Palestinians support a two-state solution, in my view. Now, frankly, I don't really consider Pay for Slay the worst thing in the world, okay? These are people that are arrested, killed, some of them perhaps justifiably. There are thousands of people in Israeli jails who are there unjustifiably detained. Some who've never been tried, who have never been found guilty, for some who there are no allegations. So there are some there. That program has now ended, so it doesn't exist anymore, for one thing. But Pay for Slay is not a reason to suggest that the Palestinians don't want two states. They have agreed to two states. Up until October 6th, as I said, Princeton University, their School of Public and International Affairs, was doing polling in Gaza. They found that 26% of Gazans supported Hamas at the time, okay? When Gazans were asked, who do you blame for your current situation? They said, Israel, Egypt, and Hamas. That's who they blamed for the desperate situation that they lived in. Now, I also mentioned the fact Hamas was elected in 2006. It threw the Palestinian Authority out in 2007, killing some of its leaders, and it has ruled Gaza with an iron fist ever since. It is not easy for Gazans to protest. Needless to say, but clearly they've had enough. 50,000 have died. Irrespective of what Hamas thought it was going to do, it should have known that Israel was going to respond in a huge way. And who is suffering? Innocent women, children, men who have died. So they are finally saying enough is enough and have the courage to protest. It's not easy. It's not easy to stand up and protest in Hungary these days. And frankly, it's, as you've seen, there are places in the United States where it's not easy to stand up and protest. So, but this is obviously a different situation. Let's hope the protests continue, because for two reasons. One, that it may have an effect on Hamas, and two, it may put an end to the view that everybody that lives in Gaza supports Hamas and deserves to be either killed or starved. It was a reaction. It was an unfortunate reaction. Literally, Bougie Herzog, the day after or 2 days after, said, all Gazans are Hamas. He said it. Now, I don't really think he meant it, but Israelis were in trauma. This was the worst attack in their country, the most number of deaths. I mean, there were more people killed in 1973, but these were innocent, largely innocent people. So they were in trauma, and they wanted revenge. But it is now widespread in Israel. It's widespread that we can't deal with them anymore. They're all bad. They're all terrorists, and it's going to take time for that, and for Palestinians, for Gazas, for Palestinians in the West Bank. What do they think about Israelis who are expanding settlements, who have just killed 50,000 people? What do you expect them to think? And what do we expect Israelis to think after that massacre that took place? But now is not the time, to be expecting rational answers from people who are in mutual trauma. Okay, so my take on the one-state reality is this. Let's assume, and I think we can assume, that right now there's sort of, as I said, 7.5 million Arabs, 7.5 million Jews in the territory. There's 5.5 million Arabs in the West Bank and in Gaza, and 20% of Israel, as you know, is Arab Israeli. So if you add the Arab Israelis in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, you got 7.5, 7.5. Let's assume, I think as most demographers do, that the Arab population is going to grow faster than the Jewish population, despite the Haredim, okay? That's kind of a given. If that happens, the one-state solution is two options. One option is that a majority Arab country is formed, and that's the end of the Jewish state. It's the end of Israel. Now, I would submit to you that that's not going to happen. Israel is not going to allow itself to disappear. Jews in the diaspora are not going to allow Israel to disappear. Most Western countries are not going to allow it to disappear. The other option of one state is for a minority Jewish population to rule over a majority Arab population, and that's apartheid. That is apartheid, clear and simple. Minority ruling over majority. Majority doesn't have equal rights. That's called apartheid. That shouldn't happen, okay? When the questioner talked about apartheid, I agree that apartheid exists in the West Bank and in Gaza. I don't agree that apartheid exists in Israel proper. Arab Israelis don't have 100% rights, but there are plenty of countries, including America, and to some extent a lesser extent, but certainly in America where everybody doesn't have full rights. So it's not apartheid, it's not equality, and it could be improved. But yeah, so one state, it's not realistic. It's not going to happen. Israel is not going to go away, and Israel should not be allowed to have a state that rules as a minority over a majority Arab population. I think we have to recognize that the various Arab states surrounding Israel-Palestine pay lip service to the Palestinian cause, but have actually done very, very little to advance it. They could have been working on governance. They could have been providing more assistance. They could have been pressuring Hamas, et cetera, et cetera. They frankly are there. They have their own interests, and the Palestinians for them are a bit of a pain in the ass. When something like October 7th happened, and I'm talking leadership, the street, the people who live in those countries are very pro-Palestinian. In Saudi Arabia, for example, the street, first of all, there are millions of Palestinians working there, but there are Palestinians throughout the Middle East, and there are Muslims throughout the Middle East who support the rights of the Palestinians to self-determination. So post-October 7, what you have seen is these countries have taken a renewed interest in a Palestinian state because there is action on the street where people have said enough is enough, and you now have these countries pushing for a two-state solution more than they had. The Saudis were, prior to October 7, prepared to do a deal with the Americans and the Israelis without the Palestinians. The Abraham Accords, which was the first breakthrough with UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, without the Palestinians. So, in other words, Israel was succeeding in integrating into the region while leaving the Palestinian issue aside. October 7 changed that. Saudi now claims that it won't do a deal with the Israelis and the Americans unless there is either, a pathway to a Palestinian state or something like that. That question may have been related to the 2.2 million people that Trump says he wants to deport or voluntarily ask to leave. Egypt will not take them. Jordan will not take them. There was a piece in the Globe and in Haaretz saying that Israel is looking at 3 countries in Africa. This is madness. The defense minister has said that they have a plan that they are working on to encourage, they will encourage Palestinians to leave Gaza. Now, if they don't go, the question is, what will they do? Donald Trump wants the Riviera of the Middle East. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir want to resettle Gaza for Israel. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich want Israel from the river to the sea. And that means Gaza and the West Bank and Israel. Canada is a country that is full of diaspora politics. Ukraine, lots of Ukrainians, anti-Russian, pro-Ukraine. We have lots of Sikhs, people, the Sikh population, which is a big voting bloc here, loved the fact that we broke relations with India. Russia, Ukraine. Anyway, Israel is as this audience knows, and as I talked about in polarization, a divisive issue. Most political parties, if they could, the Liberals and the New Democrats, if they could, would stay away from the issue. Pierre Poilievre is using it as a wedge issue to try and get the Jewish vote. he and Landsman and others in his party basically say that the liberals who advocated a ceasefire, etc., are either anti-Semitic or anti-Israel or both. So what should Canada do? To be honest with you, Canada can do almost nothing. It can be performative. It can say what it feels. It can try and represent Canadians by, I would argue, advocating for a ceasefire, continuing to promote two states, which is its policy, continue to oppose settlements, which is its policy. It could do that. But in the end, the only country that can move Israel is the Americans. The only country. The Europeans, even though they are the largest trading partners with Israel, no influence whatsoever. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, no influence. We could recognize a Palestinian state, which again would be performative. It wouldn't change things on the ground, but it might provide some hope for Palestinians and put into train something that, over time might happen. But I'm just being realistic here. Israel voted along with the United States, North Korea, and Iran and Russia, voted to oppose a resolution which condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now that was really weird. America provided $18 billion of arms to Israel in the last year alone. You will recall that post-October 7, Joe Biden was the first leader to visit. He is and was a strong Zionist. Americans see Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, a strategic ally. So both I think, when America had values and Israel had values, they saw each other as sharing a value system. Now they share a value system. It's just a different value system. We have to remember, from 1948 on, Israel was the David. Israel was the only place that would accept Jews who survived the Holocaust. It was the David. It accepted partition and was attacked by 5 Arab countries. It fought a war in 1967 when Jews thought it would disappear. It fought a war in 1973 when for the first 3 or 4 days, we thought it might disappear. Okay, I said, this is not good guys and bad guys. Okay, Israel was the David. We all, the West, supported Israel as being this democracy, this sort of socialist kibbutz, feel good, making the desert green, startup nation. That was Israel. And it had values that we as Jews, humanist Jews in North America supported. Okay? Well, our children are not seeing the Israel that we all grew up with. It's no longer, unfortunately, the David. They are seeing an Israel which is an occupier, which is, they see the world in terms of Black Lives Matter, indigenous rights, Palestinian rights. There aren't many countries in the world that are occupying another country. One of them is Russia, and the other one is Israel. You can go back and you can say, well, they missed an opportunity, they didn't do this. Hamas, you can say a lot of things. Israel is occupying this territory, and my worldview is that the two of them have to get their act together. Israel is the superpower. Palestine misses opportunities. What all Israel has to do is hold out its hand, make a real, legitimate effort. Stop the settlements, stop the killing, make an effort. And if the Palestinians are unable because of right of return or because of Jerusalem or because of something else, then at least Israel can stand up in the world and say, we tried. We made a legitimate offer. We held out our hand to you. We will go the extra mile because, we've got the arms, we've got the money, we'll do it. Now you guys respond. And if you miss this opportunity, then screw you. We're not taking the rap anymore. Israel's not doing it. That's what they should do. It can't and it shouldn't. I mean, a two-state solution means there has to be a Jewish state and an Arab state. The right of return, if it was exercised in its maximalist approach, would could bring 12 million Arabs into the Jewish state. Now, these are the great-grandchildren of people who were expelled or left in 48. If you're going to have a two-state solution, you can't have 12 million Arabs in Israel. So Israel's going to have to give up on Jerusalem. It's going to have to say East Jerusalem is the capital. The Palestinians are going to have to give up. 100,000 Palestinians can come back. All of the refugees can go to Palestine, but they cannot come back to Israel. That's apparently why Arafat couldn't do the deal. That's, some say, why Abbas couldn't do the deal. A lot of arguments back and forth about whose fault it was, blah, blah, blah. But those are the compromises that are going to have to be made. And if the Palestinians can't make that compromise, if they had made that compromise with Rabin, if they had made the compromise with Olmert, they would be a hell of a lot better off than they are now. So they shouldn't give up that opportunity again. But Israel has got to stop what it's doing. You can't sit across from somebody sharing a pizza when every 5 minutes one side grabs a part of the other's pizza, which is what is going on in the West Bank. Okay? When I was there were 250,000 settlers. There's now 750,000 settlers. 500,000 can be dealt with without a problem. They're going to stay. There's going to be a swap. Not a big deal. 250,000? Something's going to have to be done. They're either going to have to be encouraged to leave with economic assistance, with housing, with whatever, or they're going to stay in a Palestinian state, if there's a Palestinian state. Half of the people in this room's parents were refugees. My wife's not going back to Poland. She doesn't want to go back to Poland, but she's not going back to Poland, and she's certainly not going back to her mother's or father's house in Poland. I mean, you got to move on. There are millions of people around the world who are legitimate refugees who no longer live in their places, in their country, who would want to go back, but they can't go back. Okay, they can't go back. I mean, think about kids on campus call Israelis colonialists. Okay, now there's a certain element of colonialism, but Israelis, Jews were attached to that land 3,000 years ago, and they were there throughout. Yes, in the 20th century, there was a mass migration. Then there was partition. So there's an element of colonialism, and there's an element that's not colonialism. Look at Canada. Are we giving back our homes? No, I mean, seriously, when these kids scream colonialism, are you giving back your home to the indigenous people that Allen spoke about? I mean, and there's an argument there. Now, this is a lot shorter time frame, but those people, there was a war. There was a war going on. Israel accepted partition. Not the Palestinians, but the 5 countries, the 5 Arab countries said, we don't accept partition, and they went to war. Now, there were lots of skirmishes before, but the bottom line is that 750,000 people left. Some were forced out. Some were killed and their families left. Some said, I'm getting out of here, and when we win, I'm coming back. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about all of the descendants of those 750,000 people. And as I said, it's just not, it's not possible anymore. It may in a sort of sense of equity and fairness, it may seem like it's possible, but you're never going to have a two-state solution if it happens. That's the key question. People have to understand, as I said, they are both victims. They both have existential fears. We see Israelis as the IDF, as the Mossad, as occupiers. They see themselves as being threatened from all sides. My sister lives on a kibbutz that is 20 miles from the Lebanese border. I can see Lebanon and I can see Syria. When the IDF, I don't even know if it's true, but when the IDF said that Hezbollah had the same plans to cross the border and come into the kibbutzim and massacre Jews as Hamas did, you can imagine what my sister and her children and her children's children who live on that kibbutz felt. That they were going to go into their safe rooms and somebody was going to set them on fire and their entire kibbutz was going to be destroyed. So that's her perspective. And she cannot, she's starting to, but she cannot have empathy. What do you think about Palestinians who are being murdered for political reasons? I am saying that. Bibi Netanyahu went back to war for purely political reasons. The hostage families don't want him to go to war. 70% of Israelis don't want him to go to war. He went back to war. Thousands of Palestinians are going to be killed. Israeli soldiers are going to be killed. What do you think they're thinking? So, but the real problem is that you got to try and understand that this is not simple. Look at the pictures. Nobody is claiming that 60 to 70% of Gaza has not been destroyed. Nobody is suggesting there are satellite photos that show you what's going on. As I said, a study in Lancet said there are thousands of people under the rubble still. Of the 50,000, maybe a little higher now, certainly maybe 15,000 militants. Okay, so let's take 15,000 out of that. Let's say 35,000 people have been killed. Now, there's this military general in Britain who does a calculation about how many people America killed in the Second World War versus how many people were killed here, and he claims that this is a just war. I don't buy it. When it was 10,000 people, it was too many. When it was 20,000 people, it was too many. When it was 35,000 people, it was too many. Okay? This is not proportional. When you're looking at international humanitarian law, the deaths that you cause have to be proportional to your objective, your military objective. And I would argue, and I think there are many Israelis in the IDF would argue, that that was not being measured. There were tunnels, there were people hiding in hospitals. They were not going to send their soldiers in there to be shot, and they were simply going to use 2,000 and 5,000 pound bombs, and they were going to bomb, and if 50,000 people died, that was it. So, some people argue self-defense, got to get Hamas, et cetera, et cetera. The Americans, right off the bat, told Israel, don't do that. Don't do what we did in Afghanistan and in Iraq. You are going to go in, you are going to bomb civilians, you are going to turn the population against you, you are going to create more terrorists by doing it. Don't do it. Pinpoint, figure it out, what they did in Lebanon. In Lebanon, with Hezbollah, minimal civilian death, maximum effect. They had the intelligence and they did it. This was revenge. Okay, so there's multiple issues with UNRWA. First of all, it is accused of perpetuating the refugee situation because it is the only organization that is an organization that provides health, education, social security for one refugee population. UNHCR, United Nations High Commission for Refugee, takes care of all the rest of the refugees in the world. It didn't exist in 1948, so UNRWA was formed to take care of the Palestinian refugees, and it still exists. Israel says, and you know, there are academics and others in Israel, if it wasn't for UNRWA, there'd be no refugee. There wouldn't be a problem. There wouldn't be a problem. I mean, you know, I don't quite agree with that. When I was in Israel as ambassador and speaking to the head of the UN Bureau, he said, we love that Canada and you countries, because Harper was the prime minister, criticized UNRWA. But let me tell you, if UNRWA wasn't there, we, Israel, would have to be providing food, education, health services to 2.2 million people in Gaza. Okay. Now, then the story about the textbooks has been a story in social media that has been perpetuated for years and years. There is no question that over time, in different times, UNRWA runs the education system. They don't have control of all the teachers. UNRWA takes care of, has 13,000 employees in Jordan, Syria, Israel, Gaza, et cetera, et cetera. There were definite examples where sort of terrorist stuff was appearing in textbooks, okay? The United States Congress and the British government said all funding will be cut to UNRWA if this isn't fixed, okay? So literally, the United States Congress has a requirement that this cannot happen, okay? Now, does it still happen? I'm sure it does. You know that Israeli textbooks do not have the green line? There is no green line. In other words, Israeli textbooks have Israel from the river to the sea, okay? Now, do you hear people crying about this, shouting about this, that they show Israel from the river to the sea, okay? So textbooks are an issue. They are being dealt with. The bigger issue during the war was an allegation by Israel that 9 to 12 members of UNRWA were Hamasniks. One member of UNRWA was actually killed either on the way to or on the way back, so there's no question he was killed. UNRWA fired every one of the 12. No due process. They got this information from Israel, they fired them. No question. Then many Western governments cut their funding to UNRWA. Former French foreign minister was appointed to do an investigation. Almost all Western governments, including the Americans, began funding UNRWA again, in part because Israel did not provide any further evidence as to the evidence they had about these UNRWA people. Our government and other Western governments, including the Americans, sent their money back to UNRWA. Now, UNRWA has been declared persona non grata by the Israeli government. There can be no dealings with UNRWA and the Israeli government. And of course, the Trump administration has cut funding. So we'll see who delivers aid to the people that are left there. I just think we all have to sit together and talk. I understand where Jews who believe that, October 7 was so horrific and that too many Palestinians haven't condemned it, et cetera, et cetera. I don't sort of want to get into that. My take is what I said in my remarks. We've just got to get out of our own lane a little bit, try and move into the center, try and understand that there are two sides, that it's not that clear. Israel's done some bad things. Hamas obviously did some bad things. Yes, people in the West Bank, subsequent to October 7, supported Hamas. They see Hamas as this, they don't see what's going on. They don't want to see what happened in the kibbutzim any more than Israelis look at what's going on in BBC and see the devastation in Gaza. The same thing is happening here. I read Haaretz, I read Times of Israel, I read the New York Times, okay? I do more than that. Some people are reading a social media that will tell them every day, Palestinians are terrorists, Palestinians are bad, there can never be two states. That's what they read, that's what they believe. Maybe they're right. I don't believe so. I hope they're not right. And I do hope that all of us can continue to be somewhat optimistic that Jews and Palestinians, they're not special, okay? They each think that their conflict is so terrible and there've been so much death that they can't come to a deal. It's ridiculous. They can come to a deal. The issues are not that hard. They really aren't if people are prepared to compromise. They have to compromise. And that's what you don't make peace with your friends. You end conflict with your enemies. They're enemies. They have to compromise. They have to find a way forward. And then hopefully in 20 years we'll have two states, or maybe 10.